is it that God is really this brutal? Us having the pre-assumption and the pre-psychological notion position that he is supposedly the controller of all things? And obviously that there's like a nuanced kind of shift to that. Or is it that God has allowed everybody at an extreme level where collectively the collective in itself, the collective consciousness in itself has its own free will, and that free will has been allowed to do what it without will within the realm of time and space and time that it's in and coming out of. And there's just been a really extreme allowance because, like, could we really blame God for all the bad stuff that happened? I mean, it's all case by case. It's all more or less. It's how we're most sincerely working with that principle and notion of whatever God really is and how he ordains himself and explains itself to be, like Hunibku kind of material, Vedanta kind of material, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's up to you to, like, only like you can't lie to yourself if you're being sincere with following up what that could ultimately be and how, like, things are preserved however they're preserved to actually, like, distribute the knowledge of whatever's ultimately pointing to God. So is like God really that, like, is God really that nasty, or is it that we're just not on that for however we are in this present, or whenever we are in this present, within that whenever, there's still like a particular type of process upgrade that's happening where we don't necessarily know, like, what that is. We just have an idea of what, like, God is. So within that being said, anybody could, like, use and represent God as, like, something that's kind of like not the whole truth. So when I like, mention any group, I'm saying it from a scientific point of view. Like, if I were to say, like, okay, this group isn't shit, on a scientific level, like, mathematically, us compared to the universe, we aren't shit. That's like a scientific thing. And I'm saying it neutrally because that's that's a different, like, realization we could have as well. So neutrally and scientifically, everything I'm saying is pointing to the truth and the wholeness of how God could be, like, just allowing all this all of this jazz on, like, a real extreme level. And it's not for me to judge anybody, It's like things are more self-obvious these days because however someone's doing something, the younger generation could catch on, like, whatever you want to label, identify, or title, this new generation, Gen Alpha, they call it, which I just think that's like a title and a label in itself, because it could be like, the titles and the labels themselves, unbeknownst to us, they kind of limit us and they kind of, like, bound us and, like, kind of psychologically trap us in how we're using a title and an identity to puff ourselves up in a way where it's like you're kind of like, it's just kind of like a mini challenge, or even like a mini quote unquote, like, bondage, end quote, of just like you having to uphold something based on how other people expect you to uphold that title. And as you're expected to uphold that title, unnecessary sacrifices in that process could be, ultimately, like, kind of quote unquote altercated, end quote, or sent your way, or kind of like your boundaries are being tested to see what you're actually, like, allowing or not allowing on a casual psychological level. Because the casual psychological level is within the etymology, within, like, the sub magic within the language and the symbols, and how that has been kind of used on a minor level within the earth to be in correspondence to certain obelisks on, like, the geomancy of the planet Earth, the geomancy being the geographical Earth landscape, and how certain buildings are put in a certain formation for them to ultimately create a certain shape, and that shape is a certain type of, like, it's a particular type of vortex of energy. And this is already well known, this has been disclosed like 15 plus years ago. I'm just kind of like, it's just coming through us now. And if it's new to you now, great, maybe make something of the future generation for yourself. But we're not necessarily fooling like the new generation. We have this assumptive supposition of like where we just like put our own 2 cents and our own projection on what something is, when it's really not. Like, that doubt spirit, like, oh, you're not going to do this, you're not going to do that, it's never going to happen for you. That's not necessarily true at all. You're living in your own esoteric limitation and bubble and constriction, and that's because we don't necessarily know what this new generation is capable of, or what its casual limits and challenges could be in the future. Because the new generation, it's like it's up to their intelligence to see like 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 how just how they can catch on and detect what the general media is telling them. And what the general media is telling them is their words cannot necessarily align with their actions. And if your words aren't necessarily aligning with your actions, then they possibly could detect that falsehood. So it's like, and then we have to turn the spotlight on them. Like, what do we really think of like all of these, like, whatever these promoters of like the new technology or the new innovation is. Like, what is the new generation with their nourished intelligence, what do they really think about that word? And yet they could be absent of like the genuine change and productivity that could be there. Could the new generation, Gen Alpha, so they call it, but obviously I just call it, you could just call it Gen like infinity, call it Gen Rainbow, because there's no limits to this shit. So it's like, why choose like a limiting term, which we don't even necessarily know the origin of these words, but that's a different story. So within all of that, it's like could the generation eventually with nourished intelligence, could they detect how propaganda is being used from a different agenda from a particular type of sub-agency, and that sub-agency cross-references with the agency between them, and the agency above them is their coordinate quadrant of what their sector of the old outdated government is, and how it's transitioning. And what I mean by that, the sub-agency underneath the agency, everything is like, there's agencies within like this whole planet, meaning an example, meaning just like an agency for a deep casual level of an observation team, and within that observation team there's a sub communication team. So there's a sub communication agency that's fulfilling nearby agencies what someone could be as far as someone's potential. That's happening on a spiritual level. It's like we're always, and little do we know, we're always spiritually being judged. And I'm coming from an unbiased neutral level based on how I want to like craft my character within the positive messages that are coming from, the constructive part of, the spiritual woo-woo news broadcast respectively. And what I mean by that is, even when they say love yourself, that's like, you might hear that in the quote unquote new age, and that's not good. That's not bad, but look where they're coming from. Love yourself. I mean, and that's leaning more towards a productive message. And I'm not trying to fault them, but like, depending on who's like saying it and where they're at, they could still be respectively, just as it is standardly, they in their like process of like whatever they're doing to actually find liberty and moksha, like real liberty, like overall liberty. They're still in that process. And since they're still in that process, the completion is still in process. And that's not good. That's not bad. And I'm not trying to fault anybody. And there's completion within the incompletion, of course. You are enough as you are right now, supposedly, but that's not necessarily the truth in this realm, because there's more dualities within dualities and detrimental flavors that are happening. So that's not necessarily true. So look at how someone says, just take any message, any new age spiritual message, take it all. How, like, what part of like completion are they coming from, or what part of incompletion are they coming from casually? Because one example of completion to incompletion is, who am I sponsoring? Pink Lemonade. One casual example of incompletion to completion is what like part of the energy work are they doing in themselves to actually achieve their liberty? And if you're a so-called spiritual renowned teacher, how are you teaching that to receive to achieve that and receive that or whatever and believe that and see the deception within that to actually achieve that? So like I'm not and yet again I'm not fault finding anybody, but when like anybody, so here's a challenge for yourself: take any new age spiritual message that's just out there, regardless of the broadcast, radio signal or the channel or whatever. Just take any spiritual message and then intuitively ask yourselves, are they coming from a space and a notion towards completion, or are they coming from a space and a notion of an unknown incompletion? And the unknown incompletion is, it's not just one thing, it's not just like one, it's not a one size fits all, it's not just that, it's not just like saying love yourself. There's different dynamics of energy work that we have to put in to sustain that. And that's like not just the emotional boundaries, but like respectively like the esoteric psychological boundaries. Because what, like, for us to like really pull out those fucked up thoughts out of your head, that's esoteric psychological boundaries. So like, even though like the physical boundaries will get tested, it's ultimately so you could enhance your esoteric psychological boundaries, because the prize and the reward of that is the literal like spiritual peace that you're getting. And that spiritual peace is the thing that's actually needed for us to even have like respectively just enjoyment. And that frequency of enjoyment that that excites the better parts and the balanced parts of all the planets and the asteroids, and seeing how their duality selves could go back to their level of wholeness. Because if their duality selves don't go back to the level of wholeness, then they're quote unquote on a different context level, end quote. They're kind of operating from a different context of unconsciousness per the game of the Matrix. And what do I mean by that? Per the game of the Matrix. So it's like they're what do you call that? They're following up on a casting role to play a certain part, and how there's just a very unique non-human spiritual split of a shard, and how some like original God being or like original higher self being, how they themselves too have splits. And that's self-evident in itself too, because if God is supposedly infinite and everything, yet one at the same, like that ultimate paradox, then he's ultimately doing that on a non-human default energy like level. He's splitting himself, yet he's like a part of everything else. So within all of that, what's really going on is like this matrix is really colorful, and that colorfulness has a lot of like casual standard shadows, and the shadows are ultimately influencing everything, as well as the colorfulness of the constructive of their constructive side of the spirits, because God supposedly is both dark and light, So so we're always choosing like what within our construct of our limitations of our reality and all the situations we go through, we're always choosing how we think, how we could feel about something. We're always choosing how we could be better, or how we could not take accountability, respectively, as it is. We're always choosing like how we're being affected with the lack of intelligence or the not lack of intelligence, how we could keep going forward. Because if you say you're not choosing, then you're kind of giving like your minor energies and your kind of free will of choice to something outside of you that you don't necessarily know what that could be. That's not God, like that, which like, the detrimental energy of just